Okay, we're in Daniel chapter 8 today. So, chapter 7 happened about 2 years previously to chapter 8. And chapter 7's vision was the coming of the Christ under the Roman Empire. It really covered, it gave some disturbing details about the fourth beast in this particular dream. And they had to do with the Roman Empire. And on the little sheet that I gave you, it says the differences between the little horn of Daniel 8 and the little horn of Daniel 7. There are people out there that say this was the same thing. Well, it's not. They occurred at two different times. First of all, there's 2 years difference in this, and they're talking about two different empires. That empire of chapter 7, they talked mostly about the Roman Empire. The empire that they're going to be talking about now in chapter 8 is going to be the Greek Empire. And so there's two different things. The dream of chapter 7 was a dream. This one he's wide awake in. And again, Daniel says, I'm the writer of this. He says it a whole bunch of times that he's the writer of this. He keeps saying that and repeating that over and over. How somebody could think that Daniel wasn't the writer of Daniel, I don't understand that, because he just keeps telling you over and over again. So think about Daniel. You think, how old was Daniel when he first went to live in Babylon? He was probably a teenager. He could be as young as 13. And as a 13-year-old, he saw his nation fall to Babylon. Come in, the temple was desecrated. They came in, and then he was deported as a teenager all the way to the land of Babylon, where probably he was made a eunuch. He was made a eunuch. And he has lived all of this time. He's probably 69 or 70 at the occurrence of this dream. He has lived most of his life now in captivity in Babylon, either with Babylon, and then he's watched Babylon fall, and now it's the Medes and Persians. That's amazing. He has watched his home city of Jerusalem besieged and overthrown. But more than that, where do the Jews worship? Where are they required to worship? At the temple. So not only has he lost his city, but he has completely lost his place of worship. And that is where they're supposed to worship. Can you imagine how truly blessed we are? My entire lifetime, I have never had to endure something like that. To lose my nation and lose my place of worship, too. That has never occurred in my lifetime. So it's amazing how blessed beyond measure we are. But the Israelites were required to sacrifice at the temple. Well, without the temple, there weren't any sacrifices. So poor Daniel, he's living the lonely life, like I said, probably of a eunuch in Babylon. And that just makes his faithfulness to God outshine anything. I mean, it really is impressive. Yes.
But he is very productive under sad and trying circumstances.
Oh yeah. He's the man. God's chosen him. His lifelong ambition was basically to see the people to get to return home. He wanted them to get to return home, rebuild the temple, resume the worship, But Daniel's been chosen for something important by God, and it was for his prophecy. He has already learned that there is going to be one kingdom, a new kingdom, and it's going to endure forever. And he's also learned that someday there will be a Messiah. So he's been privileged to hear that kind of information. But before the coming of the Messiah, Daniel's people have more hardship to endure. The turmoil of falling nations and kings and cruel leaders. He's learning all of this too. He may have been blessed to know about the coming of the Messiah and a brand new kingdom, but he also has the burden of these prophecies that these Jewish people are going to have to endure some hard times. And it's very real. Does he believe in these visions and these dreams? He does. Well, one reason is he's seen it occur in his lifetime. He told King Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to live like an animal, and it happened. You know, he has said the Medes and the Persians are coming in tonight, and they're taking you tonight. He has seen, he believes in these, of course he does. He's not living under any illusion that these things are not going to take place. So that's when you read about his reactions to these things. Well, no, tell it. No, that's the reason he has the reactions to these things. He knows this is the truth. This is really what's going to happen. You have to reflect on, when you study the book of Daniel, the power of divine prophecy. There's a lot of power behind it. You know, man cannot see the future. At best, man can predict what might occur based on circumstances or something like that. They could. But God is the only one that can reveal for 100% accuracy centuries before. You know, only God can name future kingdoms and even kings like King Cyrus. You know, only he can do these things. So it's amazing. In this particular vision that we see of Daniel, we're going to learn about Alexander the Great, and we're going to learn about Antiochus IV. But again, these are not going to happen until centuries later. So let's get started. Let's look at chapter 8, and I'm going to read the first 14 verses of chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision about the one that had already appeared to me, after the one had already appeared to me. He's making sure you understand that. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Verse 5. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifices were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot." And he said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Okay, so I'm going to stop right there. So we've got Daniel seeing another vision approximately 2 years after the first one. Again, he states, "I'm the author of this," and he wants people to understand this is a separate vision. He specifically says that. So he is transported. I don't know whether he was there. Some things we just aren't privileged to know. Whether he was just there when this vision occurred, or had he been transported in spirit to this particular place. But either way, this was the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. And it was an appropriate place to see the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian, fall of Persia. So, Just so you know, he explains a lot of this in the next part of the chapter. In verse 20, it clearly says that the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. Okay, that's what we're talking about. It clearly states what it is. And there are two horns that represent two elements of the kingdom. This corresponds with the last chapter, chapter 7. I don't know if you remember which animal was the Medo-Persian Empire. Do you remember which one it was? It was the bear. It was the bear. And it said one side of the bear was higher than the other side or more prominent than the other side. Okay. And I said most scholars believe it just means that the Medes and the Persians, that one was greater than the other side. One was had a greater impact, I should say. Well, here it is again. It's got two horns, but one of the horns is larger, okay? Persia was the dominant power of this government, okay? So Daniel's watching the ram as he moves toward the west and toward the north and toward the south. And actually the Persian Empire came up from the east and it overran everything, including Egypt and Asia Minor. So again, if you think about the bear, you remember it had 3 ribs in its mouth. Well, Lonnie in this thing says that it could refer to the directions of the globe. You know, he comes up from the east and he goes to the west and the north and the south. That could be what the 3 ribs represent. Again, we're not privileged to know exactly what that means. But we know one thing. Both of those beasts were the Medo-Persian Empire. Okay? So as this nation moved and conquered, nobody could stop it. No nation could prevent its domination. So Daniel's standing here thinking about all this, and then all of a sudden a goat shows up. And he has a notable horn on his head. Well, we know that the third kingdom in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 and in Daniel's vision in chapter 7 is Greece. And so one notable horn would be Alexander the Great. Yes, it would be Alexander the Great. This is the Greek Empire. His most famous king, Alexander the Great, and he is represented by this prominent horn. Coming from the west is also a good indicator that this is Greece. We talked about that Greece was described as a leopard in chapter 7 because its speed and veracity at taking he took quickly. Well, it specifically says in this one that he crossed the whole earth without touching the ground. He was that fast. He was that quick. Again, it just emphasizes his swiftness and his speed as he conquered. And so what does he have the ram doing? The goat. The goat charges the ram and overtakes him, just like Alexander the Great did to the Persian Empire. He furiously attacked the Persians. Just so you know, Alexander the Great died at 33, and it took him 12 years to conquer the whole known land, basically. 33. Okay, he died at 33. He wore himself out. They say, so this was really interesting because I was reading all about his death. He died of a fever. But he was also an excessive drinker. He drank a lot. That could have attributed to whatever he had. But I also read a more recent article by some British lady that said his body didn't decompose for days after he died. It didn't start decomposing. Well, it was preserving him. Well, she says she believed that he has some autoimmune disease, that his breathing became so faint that they thought he was dead, but he wasn't dead. He survived for several days, and they didn't know it. That's what she was writing about and everything. But it's kind of a mysterious thing. But that he died of his fever. And he was only in power for 12 years. So the Persian Empire fell to Greece, and no one could prevent its fall. Now the large horn is broken off, which would be Alexander the Great, and 4 more come in its place, just like the last chapter. I even named who the 4 men were that took over, okay? Upon the death of Alexander, the kingdom was divided between 4 rulers, and actually there were 13 men who fought to carve out for themselves a piece of the Greek Empire. They fought over it. and 4 of them were left standing. One of these guys is Seleucus. Seleucus gained Babylon, Syria, and Asia Minor. So you know that area over here. Babylon, that area is the one that he gained. This is important because in the next verse we see a very small horn that comes up from one of these divisions. So you read about this guy, this small horn that comes up. He doesn't sound very good. It grew, verse 10, it grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it, and it prospered in everything it did. So, you begin to wonder, who is this person, this little horn that is growing up? And you start to look at history to try to figure out who it is. Seleucus has an ancestor called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is considered that little horn. He's also going to only reign for 12 years, but he grew in pride and power. He expanded toward the south, meaning Egypt, and toward the east, meaning Babylon, and toward the glorious land. Now, what land do you think is the glorious land? What? Mary? Well, what did the Israelites call their land? They called it the promised land, didn't they? Well,
Was it Judah?
think about where Babylon is and where Egypt is.
Yeah,
What do they have to go through to get there?
yeah, the desert.
The glorious land, or where the Israelite nation is
Yeah.
where that is located. Well, I believe he's talking about Palestine.
Yeah.
I believe it's called that because of the prominence to the Jew. Well, he is going to persecute those Jews, and we know that from history. Verse 10 says that he grew until he reached the host of heavens. In Genesis 15, God will describe the ancestors of Abraham by using an illustration. Do you remember what he told Abraham about his offspring? He looked up.
And look, as many as the stars.
As the stars, yes, he looked up and he said, your nation is going to be like the stars of heaven. Now, stars do not always speak of people, but in apocalyptic literature, it is not uncommon. Okay? And then if you look down in 24, and I know we haven't gotten there, he's going to refer, in verse 24, he's going to refer to the holy people. The holy people. He's going to destroy the mighty men and the holy people. Well, I believe that we can come to the conclusion when he talks about the stars, he's referring to God's holy people, the Jews. And when he's talking about the beautiful land, he's talking about Palestine, their homeland. So he's going to cast them down from the earth and stomp on them. What verse is that? Cast them out and stomp on them, trample on them. That is in verse 10 also. And that is just a description of an ongoing war that he's going to inflict upon the Jewish people. This guy magnifies himself. In his arrogance, he elevates himself to the rank of God. And when he wars against God's people, he might as well be warring against God himself. Okay. Verse 11 begins to talk about he took away the daily sacrifice, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. What is he talking about when he's talking about the sanctuary and sacrifices? He's talking about the temple. He's specifically talking about the temple there, yes. He's going to desecrate it, so much so that he will offer a pig on the altar in the temple, yeah. Whatever took place every day in the temple will be caused to cease. All right, so this is where we get into, I'm going to read you some things. And I want you to understand, The Greek Empire was between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Bible is silent. Why isn't that part included in the Bible? Why wouldn't it be included? When St. Jerome went to, he was going to translate the Hebrew Greek Bible into Latin. He said, I'm not going to include this part, the Maccabees books, because there were no prophets during that time. And if there's no prophets during that time, it is not God-breathed. That scripture is not inspired by God. I will not include them in the Bible. But historians like Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, Jewish historian, there are history books out there that talk all about the Maccabees and all of that. So in order to read from the book of Maccabees, I had to go to the Catholic Bible because it's included in the Catholic Bible. All right? It is a historical thing. It is not inspired by God. So how do you find the Catholic Bible on your phone? Well, you go to Bible Gateway. And when you get to Bible Gateway, you go in there and you find a version. I picked the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. And so I go there. And then you can go to their Bible book list, and listed in their Bible book list are all the ones we know, but there's also Tobit and Judith, 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees. These things that St. Jerome left out of our Bible because they are not inspired, and you can read in 1st Maccabees about some very interesting people from history. In fact, chapter 1 of 1st Maccabees is titled Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes. So I'm going to read you a little bit of this, if I can get my Bible to open. Oh, are you not going to open? I'm struggling here. Come on. Because it's so interesting. Okay, here we go. So just listen, bear with me as I read this. Okay, this is chapter 1 of 1st Maccabees. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. And when the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army, and he ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. After this he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. All true to history. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. Verse 10, from then came forth a sinful root. Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, he had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. For since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile customs, and removed the marks of circumcision, and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. When Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, in order that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants and cavalry and a large fleet. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and many were wounded and fell. They captured the fortified cities in the land of Egypt, and he plundered the land of Egypt. But after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned to the 143rd year. He went up against Israel, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary, took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light and all its utensils. He took also the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for the drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decorations on the front of the temple, and he stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up a lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all of the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem.
There's a 9-minute slowdown on Farm to Market Road 1488 in 2 miles. You're still in the
Deceitfully he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. He took captive the women and children and seized the livestock. Then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there sinful people, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food and collected the spoils of Jerusalem, and they stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. And because of them the residents of Jerusalem fled. She became a dwelling of strangers. She became strange to her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became desolate like a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning. Her Sabbaths into a reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory, and her exaltation was turned into mourning. I want to get to the part where it says, Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king, and many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion, and they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah, and he directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbath and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. And he added, Whoever does not obey this command of the king shall die. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge that they had. It goes on and on about details of deaths, that if anyone found possessing the book of the covenant or anyone who adhered to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel. It says, according to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. This is all in the first book of Maccabees. And you say, who are the Maccabees? The Maccabees were a group of Jews that decided to fight against Antiochus. They were rebels. They were a rebel force, and they were a thorn in his flesh. He was never able to totally wipe them out. And in the end, he's going to die because he's only going to be around for 12 years. Chapter 4 of Maccabees goes into even more detail about what he did to the people of Israel. So you look at that and you say, who could he possibly be talking about here? Well, he's talking about this guy is who he's talking about. And verse 12 gives us the reason why God allowed this to happen. Because of rebellion. You know, rebellion is different from you know, when I pray to God and I ask Him to forgive me of my sins, sometimes it's sin that I'm not even aware of. Sometimes it's sin I am aware of. But it's not rebellion. I'm not totally turning my back on God. But that's what these people did. They were totally turning their back on God. And because they were, God says, I'm going to allow this to happen. Okay? God did not lack power. The people were evil. And because of the sins of the Jews, the true way of worshiping God was completely altered by Antiochus. So there's an angel speaking in verse 13, and what he says is not recorded. But then another angel comes along and asks the first a question. And what's the question? The question is, how long? How long is this going to go on? How long will Antiochus be allowed to desecrate the temple and dominate the Jews in this fashion? And the answer is given to Daniel, but what does it mean? 2,300 evenings and mornings. So is he talking figuratively or is he talking literally? We don't know. So whenever I'm doing the study, you know what my sources are. One of my sources is Sunset School of Preaching. Okay, and I read and study. I have their videos and everything. The other source is Lonnie. And every once in a while, doesn't happen very often, they differ. Well, there's a difference here. There's a difference here. The 2,300 years. Sunset's like, this is what it means. And then Lonnie's like, this is what I think it means, Well, they're two different things. So this 2,300 evenings and mornings could be days. Now, why God didn't say days, I don't know. Okay, but it could be days. If it's days, then it's 6 years and 140 days. Okay, so he was king for 12. And could he be saying that the time period that they're going to suffer is 6 years and about half of the time that he was king? Who knows? Or it could be, when he says evenings and mornings, he's talking about sacrifices. So you divide that 2,300 in half, and it's 1,150 days. Now, what I'm going to say is I'm not going to tell you what I think. Because I don't know. What I honestly know is that a time limit is given. And isn't that what's important? Okay? There is going to be a domination of this man, but it is going to end, and it's actually going to end at his death. I know that. So that kind of thing really doesn't matter to me, but there is a time limit that is put upon this guy. And when he dies, the temple will then be restored, rededicated, and the sacrifices will again start recurring. So let's look at verse 15. I'm going to read to the end of the chapter real quick. So starting in verse 15. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and I fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, and then he touched me and he raised me to my feet. And he said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off, represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation and will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days, and then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Okay, so, if you're sitting here and you've seen this, do you think you'd understand it? Well, no. Daniel didn't understand it. He's sitting there trying to understand all of this. And I don't know, Peter's vision when he was on the rooftop and he saw the sheep come down and all the animals come down in there, and it happened 3 times. He was told to kill and eat, and Peter's like, I'm not doing it, kind of thing. He was still in the middle of this, wondering and contemplating when Cornelius's men show up at the gate. And he's got to travel all the way to where Cornelius lives. And by the time he reaches Cornelius, he realized, I'm supposed to teach this man even though he's a Gentile. So somewhere along the way, Peter had an aha moment. That's what that means. This is what's going to happen. But even Peter didn't understand. He's sitting contemplating too. Daniel is too. Daniel's sitting here. I don't understand this. I'm perplexed. So an angel comes apparently in a human form. And who is this angel? Oh, we're going to read about him again. The same angel's going to be for Joseph, meet with Joseph and meet with Mary about baby Jesus. I'm like, oh, wow, here he is in the book of Daniel talking to Daniel, And so this voice, whatever voice this is, tells Gabriel, you need to go explain this to Daniel. And so Gabriel goes. And he begins to explain it apparently in a language that Daniel can understand it. Possibly it was Hebrew, And he refers to Daniel as the Son of Man. And all that means is that's a title for a human or a mere mortal. Because Jesus was also called a Son of Man. And Ezekiel was called the Son of Man 93 times in the book of Ezekiel. To remind you that Ezekiel was just a man. That Daniel is just a man. And Jesus was a man. Okay, so it was good. It was good. So the vision has to do with the time of the end. You cannot take this out of context. This is where the Jehovah's Witness went. Oh, it's the time of the end. This is when this is Jesus coming back. No, what have we been talking about? We've been talking about the Medes and the Persians. And then we've been talking about the Greeks. And we've been talking about the suffering of these people. And the time of the end is the end of this suffering. That's what, if you keep it into context, that's what we're talking about. I wish I had more time because I have all this information about Jehovah's Witness and what they took the 2,300 days to mean. They actually thought it meant years. And they came up with the date of 1849 that Jesus was going to return. So in 1849, there were a whole bunch of people in the United States that sold everything they had and went up into the hills to live, waited for Jesus to return that entire year. Well, guess what? He didn't return. I went 1843. He didn't come back in 1843. Guess what? He still hadn't come back. They said, well, maybe we should wait a year. Maybe I got it wrong by a year. They waited another year. He still didn't come back. Until one of the followers, and I think this was a sect of Jehovah's Witness that did this, one of the followers says, well, I had a vision. It was a she. She said, well, Mary Ellen White, I had a vision and Jesus did return, but he was invisible. He returned by going into another room in the heaven, and he cleansed the holy place in heaven. At that time, he began an investigative judgment with all the books open. He's up there, and they are looking into the books, and they are judging each person individually. And when they finish, he'll be coming back, and we'll see him then.
Okay.
Well, apparently, she's long gone. She's long gone, and he's still up there, apparently, with the books open. But that is man's interpretation of this, and you have to keep things into context. God's interpretation is he told you who the goat was, and he told you who the ram was, and when he talks about the end of the time, he's talking about that end of the time of the persecution. That's what he's talking about. So Daniel is extremely tired and sleepy, and the angel actually has to sit him up on his feet. I guess just because of the, I don't know, the burden of this information, the understanding of the information, why he had a hard time with it. But the angel then clearly identifies the ram as the Medo-Persian, and the goat is Greece. The horn is the first king, which is Alexander the Great. He dies at 32. Four more come up from that. 4 kingdoms come up from that. And then he goes into great detail again about Antiochus. The man was cruel, he was evil, he was a master of intrigue. It refers to his cunning and deceitful character. And he reminds, look at verse 24. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. And throughout Daniel, there's these little bits of information that this guy didn't make it on his own. God was always behind this. He was behind this, and he emphasizes that to Daniel. He is where he is because I have granted him that. He has been granted authority by God. It was God's providence that allowed this king to have power. So it does say in verse 25, he will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself the superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. When he says he takes his stand against the prince of princes, who do you think he's referring to?
God.
Yeah, or Jesus. Yes. He takes his stand against God or Jesus. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So in his opposition and his arrogance, he is against deity itself. And then it says, but he will be destroyed, but he won't be destroyed by human power. Now, if he's not destroyed by human power, who is he destroyed by? God's going to take care of him. So without any human help or effort, by no visible cause, he will be overcome. This is by the unseen power of God himself. So Daniel is told in the vision to seal up the vision. That doesn't mean keep it secret. Okay? Doesn't mean keep it secret. What it means is preserve it. Preserve this. Preserve it for future generations to read. These events would not come into fruition for some 400 years, but God tells Daniel to write it down and preserve it. The people that were faithful could prepare themselves for this event in history. Isn't it easier to endure something if you know there's an end to the suffering? Yeah, I think so. So, I'm going to read this little bit about Josephus. I found this really interesting. Josephus, a Jewish historian, tells us that when Alexander the Great conquered the world, that he was ushered in by the high priest of the Jews to the temple. They went up in the temple and they found a copy of the book of Daniel. It was brought down to him, opened, and he was showed Daniel chapter 8, where it predicted that the Grecian Empire would conquer the Medo-Persian Empire. When Alexander the Great saw that passage, he declared the Jews to be a holy people. No one was to harm them. That is the reason Alexander the Great did not destroy Jerusalem when he conquered the world. He was so convinced that the God of Israel was the God that had chosen him to conquer the world. He was the God that predicted in Daniel. He was the God that predicted in Daniel that he would do so. Antiochus Epiphanes arose. He persecuted God's people, but he was thrown down. So I thought that was fascinating. Now, to be honest with you, I did not have time to dig to be sure that that was a true statement. Sometimes when Sunset has something in their booklet, I'll go online and I'll read just like, okay, before I say this, I'm going to be sure. Because we have to, when this was written, they did not have to their advantage what I have today. That I can go in and dig through history books and stuff and see all of these things. But so you might want to do that, but I found that very, very interesting. Daniel really feels the heaviness of what he has seen and heard. He's exhausted physically and mentally so much that he is sick. He goes to bed for days over this. I guess he needs some time to rest, and then he gets up and does his political duties. Does Daniel understand the ramifications of this vision? The fact that his own people would stray so far away from Jehovah that they would have to endure such a tyrant because of their sins. The truth can really be hard to grasp, and maybe the reason it's put in here that Daniel had to rest and go was because he did realize the ramifications of this. It was hard to bear. So I hope I covered that, and it's clear as mud for you, because let me tell you, the further we go in this, the more historical it becomes. It just gets into more and more history of leaders and Cleopatra and all kinds of people. So anyway,